Right, so welcome to this special online class for the psychology of learning. Today what we're going to do is we're going to finish up our look at Chapter 9, Escape, Avoidance, and Punishment. And this is a special online class to make up the medical leave due to having suffered a concussion last week. All right, so thank you for joining me today. And what we're actually going to do today is going to be a little bit shorter than initially planned, just because that's the way it worked out in the syllabus. So we're going to take a quick recap to look at what we've covered in punishment so far. And then we're going to end today with a look at effective use of punishment. So if you are going to use punishment and you have weighed all the pros and cons and you're doing it in a careful manner, what is the most effective way to use that punishment procedure? So in terms of the types of punishment, we took a look at positive punishment, where you present something and that behavior decreases. That's positive punishment. We also looked at negative punishment, when you take away something and the behavior decreases, and that's negative punishment. Negative punishment had both timeout and response cost variations. And we also took a look at some of the problems associated with punishment, including the very devious one where the use of punishment is often strongly reinforced. So punishment is a procedure that the punisher themselves is often reinforced for doing, which leads to an increase in the level of punishment. And we saw this, that if somebody is implementing a positive punishment procedure, such as what happened to Rodney King in the Rodney King beating, that is a positive punishment procedure, but the people that are implementing that punishment procedure are actually also under a negative reinforcement contingency for using that punishment, and that is one of the reasons why this escalated over their experience to such a high degree. And then lastly, we took a look at some of the benefits of punishment, the fact that punishment can lead to an increase in social behavior, so you can use a punishment procedure to bring out social behavior in individuals that might not interact with you very socially. And then also it has the benefits of actually improving somebody's mood, and punishment can also increase attention to the environment. All right, so let's say that you've weighed the pros and cons, you've taken a look at the benefits, you've taken a look at the problems involved with punishment, and you decide to go through with a punishment procedure, a punishment contingency, in order to modify a behavior. What we're going to end up finishing with today is taking a look at the effective use of punishment and some tips for making those punishment procedures as effective as possible, basically making the learning outcomes as strong as possible while minimizing the amount of punishment that is required. So tip number one, punishment should be immediate rather than delayed. So if you want to make punishment effective, much like other contingencies, if the punisher is delivered immediately following the behavior, that is the most effective use of punishment. So we'll go back to the Harry video for examples of these tips in action. So if you recall in the Harry video, Harry was being punished in a punishment procedure. There was a negative punishment procedure where his restraints were taken away whenever he self-abused. And notice that every single time that he self-abused, the punishment was immediate. So as soon as Harry hit himself, as soon as that self-abuse occurred, at that moment, Dr. Fox stopped everything that he was doing and the restraints were taken out. That was in order to make that punishment as effective as possible. And then later on, when Dr. Fox was implementing the positive punishment for Harry's close talking, notice again that he did it immediately as soon as Harry got into his face. He didn't wait for Harry to get into his face and start talking there and stay there for about 30 seconds. He did it as soon as Harry got into his face, he got into Harry's face. That positive punishment immediately following that target behavior makes it much more effective. All right, tip number two. Punishment should consistently follow each occurrence of the unwanted behavior. So this is in contrast to reinforcement, where oftentimes, especially if you want a high rate of behavior, you will have a intermittent schedule of reinforcement, like a variable ratio schedule, and that will lead to a high rate of behavior for reinforcement, and it'll also lead to a behavior that is very robust or immune to extinction. On the other hand, for the effective use of punishment, your punishment should, if you're the punisher, you should have that consequence consistently follow every single occurrence of the unwanted behavior. And again, we saw this in the treatment of Harry. Every single time Harry self-abused, the timeout procedure was used, the punishment procedure was used. There was no time when Dr. Fox let it slide. There was no time when Dr. Fox decided to go to an intermittent punishment procedure where once every 5 target behaviors was punished. For the effective use of punishment, every single time the target behavior occurs, the punishment consequence should be implemented. All right, tip number 3. Punishment should be intense enough from the outset to suppress the target behavior. So this tip number 3 is one that is kind of difficult to nail down exactly how intense a punishment should be. But basically, if you start your punishment at a level that is too low, you will eventually have to raise your punishment level to a extremely high level before that punishment changes the behavior. As opposed to if you started at a higher level, you wouldn't have to increase the punishment level in order to change the behavior. So if you start too low, you'll actually end up with a punishment that is more intense than if you started at a sufficient level. And then tip number 4, negative punishment is generally preferable to positive punishment. So many of these problems with punishment are not seen as much with negative punishment, where you take something away, rather than positive punishment, where you present something as a consequence. And we saw both of these tips number 3 and tip number 4, at use in Harry's treatment. Because if you remember, in Harry's treatment, they had 3 levels of punishment. They had the timeout procedure, they had the contingent shock procedure, and then they had level 3, the full body restraint procedure. And thankfully for them, that first punishment, that 5-minute timeout procedure, was intense enough in order to change Harry's behavior. Had they started out with a lower amount of timeout, had they only started out with maybe a 10-second timeout procedure, that might have not changed the behavior, at which point they would have to up the timeout, at which point they would have to up the timeout, at which point they would have to up the timeout. And what would happen is that instead of ending at 5 minutes of timeout, if you start too low, you might end up at like 10 minutes, 20 minutes of timeout from restraints, or you might have to go to those other levels. So the picking of 5 minutes of timeout from restraints was very effective in the sense that it was enough of a punishment, it was of enough intensity that they did not need to increase it. And then secondly, negative punishment is generally preferable to positive punishment. The main form of punishment when they were treating Harry, that timeout procedure, is negative punishment. That's what the entire treatment was based around. And again, that is preferable to some of the other positive punishment procedures that they had at level 2, and actually it would be at level 2. All right, tip number 5. Punishment is more effective when accompanied by an explanation. So when you do punishment, and this is only for human subjects where you can actually explain to them why the punishment occurred, is much more effective than simply punishing the individual. Now that doesn't mean to say that you need to have that explanation. Rats can be punished, dogs can be punished, birds can be punished, and they will learn. Their target behavior will decrease. Humans, if they're punished without an explanation, their target behavior will also decrease. However, punishment is much more effective. It takes much fewer trials to learn when that when that punishment is followed by an explanation. So, especially in the early going, Harry was continually explained that if he self-abused, they were going to leave with his restraints. When they left with the restraints, Harry was often told, because you didn't take your restraints off by yourself, I'm leaving with the restraints. Because you self-abused, I'm leaving with the restraints. Or after self-abuse, Dr. Fox would just be like, take him out, 5 minutes of time out. So Harry was given explanations for why he was being punished, especially in the early going. And that made the use of punishment, the use of the 5 minutes of timeout, much, much more effective. He would have eventually learned not to self-abuse without these explanations. But again, the number of trials required vastly decreased with that explanation. All right, tip number 6. Punishment of an inappropriate behavior should be combined with positive reinforcement for an appropriate behavior. So this is, remember, this is one of the problems of punishment, that it often leads to a general decrease in behavior across a wide variety of behaviors. So to combat that problem, and also to make sure that the subject is being rewarded or reinforced for positive behaviors that you want to increase, punishment should usually be combined with a concurrent schedule where appropriate behavior is reinforced. So, for example, when Harry was being treated, they had punishment procedures like timeout procedures. They had punishment procedures like when Dr. Fox positively punished Harry with his close talking. However, those were combined with or done concurrently with reinforcement contingencies, where Harry was reinforced with Coke and pretzels, where Harry was reinforced with, playing with the ball, with praise, where Harry was reinforced with a trip to the 7-Eleven and the Three Musketeers from the icebox. So again, Harry was under a punishment contingency, but that entire time he was also being reinforced for appropriate non-abusive strategies. So for example, when he did a learning task, Dr. Fox gave him positive reinforcement by praising him. Dr. Fox also gave him Coke and pretzels, which was also a form of positive reinforcement. So again, if you are going to put in a punishment procedure, remember these tips to make it as effective as possible. And don't forget to also concurrently put a reinforcement procedure for appropriate behaviors to make sure that they're not suppressed overall, and you get that effective use of that punishment procedure. All right, so I mentioned it was going to be a little bit shorter than anticipated. That's all that we're going to have, so very quick, and thank you for joining me on this special online class. And next time that we meet, we're going to take a look at Chapter 10, which is the choice and matching chapter, and we'll get ourselves ready for the upcoming exam. Other than that, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.